Have to turn on the talk sign to say that, so I'll say it again for the subcommittee will come to order. Good morning, and let me welcome all of our guests. Today, we are examining child poverty in America and the immense physical toll and financial strain it puts on our young people, our families, and our nation. Our ranking member, Congressman Tom Cole of Oklahoma, would love to be here, but we're all doing double duty on various committees. He is held up at the Rules Committee. So I'm going to ask unanimous consent to enter his remarks into the record. To frame the impact of poverty on our children, I want to mention the work of Dr. Pamela Cantor, a psychiatrist who specializes in childhood trauma. After 9/11, New York City's Department of Education asked her organization, the Children's Mental Health Alliance, to assess the impact of the attack on the city's public school children. She found children were traumatized, but much more so by growing up in poverty. Poverty was a daily attack on their well-being. So it is for millions of children across our country who go to bed hungry, who wake up cold, grow up with less, and struggle in communities that provide few chances to succeed, to grow, and to make mistakes without destroying lives. Let us remember that poverty has a pernicious impact on the development of children. It is a lifelong scar, and I know that our panelists will elaborate on this. The subcommittee provides some of the largest sums of discretionary funds in the Congress for the well-being of children, especially those in poverty. Early childhood programs, from the Child Care and Development Block Grant to Early Head Start, and Preschool Development Grants. Education programs like Title I and Title II, Gear Up, TRIO, and the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program. And labor programs that help connecting people to the training skills they need to make ends meet, such as WIOA, training grants, Job Corps, and apprenticeships. In fact, the budget for the Administration for Children and Families in the Department of Health and Human Services is larger than the entire budget for either the Department of Justice, the Department of Interior, or the Treasury Department. So measures to address child poverty are an apt and fitting topic for us to review. In fact, this hearing is the next step in the process started by the Appropriations Committee years ago. It was in 2015 that the full committee accepted by voice vote an amendment that was introduced by our colleagues, both of whom serve on this subcommittee, Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California and Congresswoman Lucille Roybal Allard of California. What they wanted to have, to fund, and which is what we did on a bipartisan basis, a comprehensive, nonpartisan National Academy of Sciences study of child poverty in the United States. The evidence-based report was to, quote, provide its assessment of the most effective means for reducing child poverty by half in the next 10 years. I want to commend again. You won't find two more committed individuals than Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Congresswoman Lucille Roybal Allard. And if I can tell you, they are indefatigable. They do not give up for 1 second. And they have demonstrated their leadership in this regard. The results of their leadership in this subcommittee's investment bore fruit last year when the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released their report, A Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty. Because we invested in this report, from HHS's Administration for Children and Family, Social Services, and Income Maintenance Research, it is only fitting that we see it through to actually discuss the findings and let us put the dollars to work. The National Academy's report is exhaustive and demonstrates the immense national cost of childhood poverty. It outlines how we can have child poverty in 10 years. Let me quickly run through some of the takeaways on the scale and the demographics of child poverty in America. 2015, 9.6 million children lived in poverty. That's about the size of the population of the state of Michigan, living in households with inadequate economic resources. 2.1 million were living in deep poverty, households with grossly inadequate resources. That is about the population of New Mexico. With regard to race, and I quote, the poverty rates for Black, 17.8%, and Hispanic, 21.7% children, were more than double those of non-Hispanic white at 7.9% children. The report also notes that child poverty is not an individual problem. NIS estimates that childhood poverty costs the United States between $800 billion to $1.1 trillion annually from increased crime, worsened health, lower earnings when poor kids become adults. That is the scale and the scope of the problem. Then, the solutions. As the NAS report states, and I quote, poverty alleviation can promote children's development, both because of the goods and services that parents can buy for their children and because it may promote a more responsive, less stressful environment in which more positive parent-child interactions can take place. Study after study has shown that the first few years are essential to long-term outcomes for kids. But for our children to thrive, we have to support them at this vulnerable time of crucial development. The report does not identify a silver bullet. Instead, it measures the effectiveness of four different packages of policies. I will note that the NAS task force, which represents the consensus of the scientific community, found that, quote, work requirements are at least as likely to increase as to decrease poverty. Instead, to actually reach the goal of cutting deep poverty in half, we need to employ one of three policies: a universal child tax credit, increases in the SNAP, the food stamp program, or housing vouchers. Other policies matter, like SSI, Social Security insurance, but do not get you there. While these are not in our specific jurisdiction, they are worthy of our attention as appropriators. In particular, the task force said the single policy that would do more than any other to reduce child poverty is a universal $2,700 child tax credit, which would single-handedly cut child poverty by a third. To expand and strengthen the child tax credit, I am proud, and I hope this doesn't sound self-serving, but I am proud to have introduced the American Family Act in the House of Representatives with Congresswoman Susan DelBene of Washington. The Family Act makes fully refundable the child tax credit and a new young child tax credit. And according to Columbia University's Center on Poverty and Social Policy, doing so would cut child poverty nearly by 38% and deep child poverty in half. Let me close so that we can turn to our witnesses. I believe today's hearing is so important because it is vital that we delve into the problems that so many of our programs aim to solve. As we have said, the Labor H Bill makes opportunity real for families so that everyone has a better chance at a better life. This report, our report that we secured on a bipartisan basis, identifies how much is left to do. Millions of children remain prisoners of their parents' poverty. Not all of the policies may be in our jurisdiction, but what is in our jurisdiction as the Congress and as the Appropriations Committee is to be advancing policies that can help immensely, and then can help immediately. I am reminded of the words of Bobby Kennedy. He said, and I quote, "I believe that as long as there is plenty, poverty is evil. Government belongs wherever evil needs an adversary, and there are people in distress. There are people in distress. There are children in distress. There is no time to delay." I thank you very much, and now what we will do is we will proceed to the opening statements from our panelists, and let me briefly introduce our panelists. First is Catherine Eden, professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University. Next will be Cheryl Brunson of the Brookland Manor Tenants Association, a representative with the D.C. Poor People's Campaign. Next is Dolores Acevedo Garcia, professor of human development and social policy at Brandeis University. Next is Douglas Besheroff, professor with the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Then we have Autumn Burke, Assemblywoman for the 67th Assembly District in the California State Assembly. If you don't mind, I just have to say the daughter of a member of Congress, Yvonne Brathwaite Burke, who we all remember as such someone with a strong and determined effort to help people all over this country. Proud to have you here with us today. Next is Matt Weidinger, a Rowe Fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. And last but not least is Erwin Garfinkel, Professor of Contemporary Urban Problems at Columbia University. I say this to all of you, your full written testimony will be entered into the hearing record, and so you will be recognized now for 5 minutes. Catherine?
In the early 1990s, I traveled the country interviewing hundreds of low-income single mothers about their survival strategies, culminating in the book Making Ends Meet, which was published on the eve of welfare reform. But I then went on to study other topics. However, in 2010, my work took me full circle when I came to knock on the door of the home of Ashley. She was a 19-year-old mother with a newborn. Now, on that day, her hair was unkempt. She wasn't making eye contact. As she moved her baby from one shoulder to the other, she wasn't properly supporting her baby's head. And I was stunned to learn that there was no cash income coming into this household, not from work, not from welfare, or from any other source. I had not encountered this situation once in my interviews in the early 1990s. A thought occurred to me. Could it have been that in the aftermath of welfare reform, a new kind of poverty had arisen, one so deep we hadn't even thought to look for it? At the end of that interview, we gave Ashley $50, as we usually do, but I was worried about her and the baby, so I asked if we could come by the next day. Imagine our surprise when we found Ashley on her way out the door to search for a job. She had purchased a home perp and a used pantsuit. There was quite literally a spring in her step as she made her way down the sidewalk. Another thought occurred to me. Could it be that in the world's most advanced capitalist society, a mere $50 cash could be the difference between the dispirited woman we had met the first day and the motivated job seeker we met the second? To answer these questions, I teamed up with Luke Schaefer, an expert on the survey that best captures the income of the poor, and we documented a dramatic rise in the number of households with children living on virtually no cash income since the mid-1990s. We then replicated these results with data from the SNAP program, finding that about 1.2 million families on SNAP reported zero income in 2017, up from just a few 100,000 in the mid-1990s. Now, for us, these numbers posed as many questions as answers. We knew we had to find other families like Ashley's and learn more about their lives. So we followed 18 such families in 4 locations for many months and sometimes years. And from this work, we developed 3 hypotheses about what was behind the rise of this new form of poverty, extreme poverty. The first was the virtual death of cash welfare. Only a small number of states, as you know, have anything resembling their pre-reform system. This program is now called TANF. And nationwide, only 23% of poor families receive TANF. This is down from 2/3 in the mid-1990s. Most remarkably, when the families we followed had hit hard times, it hadn't even occurred to most of them to even knock on welfare's door. Second, housing instability is a hallmark of life for the extreme poor. Our family stories revealed that doubling up was what most often exposed their children to emotional, physical, and sexual harm. The number of homeless school children has doubled since the mid-2000s. We document a direct link between the decline of cash welfare and the rise of child homelessness. For every 100 fewer TANF cases within a state over a year, there are 14 more homeless students. Third, low-wage employment has become increasingly perilous. Initially, we thought families in extreme poverty might be cut off from the world of work, but their stories were full of jobs held, lost, and searched for. Perilous work, when combined with unstable living situations, created a toxic alchemy which spiraled many of our families into a spell of extreme poverty. How do families survive? Food pantry utilization has risen dramatically since the mid-1990s, but these and other private charities can't begin to cope with the scope of the need. Most families in our sample had to trade SNAP for cash, often at a steep discount just to buy basics like socks and underwear for their kids and to keep the lights on. Many bore a scar on the inside of their elbow from selling their blood plasma frequently. In the U.S., plasma donations have increased fourfold since the mid-1990s. Some claim the U.S. poor are not poor. We constructed an index of deep disadvantage that combines measure of poverty, health, and intergenerational mobility. We find that average life expectancy in Americans' most disadvantaged places is roughly comparable to what is seen in places such as Bangladesh, North Korea, and Mongolia, and infant birth rate outcomes are similar to those in Congo, Uganda, and Botswana. We can argue about the causes and consequences of poverty and what to do about it, but can anyone really argue that we've solved it? Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
You're right. Did I get it on? The green is on now.
The green is on, sorry. Deloro and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm a professor at Brandeis University, and I also had the honor of being a member of the committee of the National Academies that put together the report, A Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty. I want to thank Representative Lee and Representative Roybal-Allard for their critical role in creating the National Academies Committee. My role today is to summarize our main findings. First of all, we found that poverty is a very serious problem for the United States. It's very serious, of course, for the children that experience poverty. It compromises their health, their learning, their development, and also their outcomes as adults, including their employment prospects and well-being. It also costs the nation between $800 billion and $1.1 trillion per year. So it affects all of us. 13% of children today live in poverty, that is 9.6 million, and 2.9% of children live in deep poverty, that is 2.1 million children. Just to have a sense of what families are experiencing, the threshold for poverty in 2017 was $25,000 per year for a family of 4. Poverty, of course, has very harmful consequences throughout the life course for any child that experiences poverty, but it has a stronger effect for some children because they are more likely to experience poverty. Particularly, Hispanic children have the highest poverty rate today, about 22%. Black children have the second highest poverty rate, 18%. White children have a poverty rate of 8%. Our statement of task directed us first to examine the research evidence that child poverty compromises child well-being. Our main conclusion is that the weight of the evidence is that income poverty causes negative effects on children, especially when poverty starts early in childhood or occurs during a large proportion of childhood. The second aspect of our statement of task was to identify the major assistance programs that today help reduce child poverty. The committee concluded that poverty will be much higher with our major programs. Specifically, the ITC, the Child Tax Credit, and SNAP have major effects on reducing poverty, and SNAP and Social Security have major effects on reducing deep poverty. Despite the very important poverty-reducing effects of these programs, still 13% of our children live in poverty today, and 2.9% live in deep poverty. So our statement of task, the core aspect of it, directed us to examine programs and policies with the potential to reduce child poverty by half in 10 years. That is, we were asked to try to reduce poverty to about 6.5% and deep poverty to about 1.5%. We examined 20 different individual policies and programs and found that none of them on its own would achieve the goal of reducing poverty by half. However, we found some promising possibilities. One of them was to increase the EITC by 40%, which would reduce child poverty from 13 to 10.9%, but it would have modest effects on reducing deep poverty. Another very promising approach is a child allowance that my colleague Irv Garfinkel, who was also a member of the committee, will explain during his presentation. Because none of these individual policies achieve the goal of reducing child poverty by half, we also consider policy packages, which are combinations of policies and programs that together can achieve the goal. We specifically identify 2 packages that can achieve this goal. Package 3, which we name Means Tested and Work package, includes expansion to the EITC, the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, the Section 8 voucher program, and SNAP. We also identify package 4, whose core element is a cash allowance for children of $2,700 per year per child. It has some other elements that we can discuss later, but that is the main component. These 2 packages not only reduce child poverty by half, but also increase employment substantially. In sum, our main finding overall is that child poverty today is not an intractable problem. We can reduce child poverty today by 50%, and we know how to do it. We have 2 specific packages that would allow us to do that today. Thank you.
Mr. Besheroff?
Thank you. Chairman DeLauro, nice to see you again. Members of the committee, I'm delighted to be here. This is an important topic, and I was delighted to be invited to speak. I know many of the members of the committee. They've produced an impressive report, but here comes the but. And the but is, I think it takes too narrow a view of the causes of poverty and too narrow a view of what we should do about it. I think it adopted that view because of the charge given to it, combination of the legislation and HHS instructions, which said you need absolute support for the proposal before you make it. And let me explain the two examples of why the report's too narrow. It addresses the problems of single mothers, but makes no recommendations that I saw, and I'm happy to be corrected, about dealing with single parenthood by itself. I was raised by a single mother. I think I sort of came out okay. But there's no doubt that being raised in a family with a single mother adds extra stresses and makes it much more difficult for a child to grow and prosper. Child care, income supports are only part of the answer. And I would have loved to see the report talk about more. And the report didn't, because the evidence we have about single parents programs is not as strong as giving money to people. You give money to people and you can measure that they have more money every day. You give someone a better education and it's extremely difficult to measure that. So my advocacy to you is, when you consider implementing this report, please think about problems like single parenthood. The other thing the report talks about, but I think has no specific recommendations, is about race and discrimination. Congressman John Lewis says it's a different America today from 1960 and before, and of course that's correct, but racial differences are still great. This morning, I saw in the paper that the racial differences in the schools, in the Boston public schools, are so great that the advocates are pressing for the state to take over the entire school system of the city of Boston. I think that's a sign of the problems that go beyond putting more money into the system alone, hear me. But we have to address these other things. I used to say this to Senator Moynihan, and he would say, but I'm in the Senate Finance Committee. I don't have jurisdiction. You have jurisdiction over some of these programs. So please, whatever you do on the rest, think about programs for single mothers. Think about programs that address the racial and ethnic differences that we have in our society, because those are the things that are going to make the long-term difference for the families that we're talking about. So let me kind of be fancy about it. This is what I wrote in my testimony. I said, the result of the committee's approach, because of the mandate it had, so this is nothing personal, I think, was to exclude recommendations of new or promising ideas that either had not been tested or, at least in their initial iterations, had not been found successful. That was one heck of a limitation for the proposals that should be made and adopted by this committee and this Congress. And it's the equivalent of saying to Silicon Valley, come up with a plan for 10 years from now, but assume no additional scientific breakthroughs. Just use what you have on the table. Don't think about anything new. Don't think about anything fresh. The members of the committee didn't write that, but that is what where these recommendations take us. And I think that will dry up energy in other areas. So in these conversations, I hope we talk about the broad range of causes of poverty. The last thing I'll say in 56 seconds is that in their proposals about expanding cash benefits, I think they minimize the problem of benefit reduction rates, which is the phase-out rate on many of these programs. Many of us, on the left as well as the right, think they discourage work, discourage marriage. The penalty for cohabiting parents to marry in most states is between 10 and 40% of their income, between $30,000 and $50,000 of income. We don't need that. We could fix it. We fixed it in the income tax code. We could fix it in means-tested benefits, and it would make it easier for people to marry, and they wouldn't face the same kind of penalties if they worked. Thank you very much.
Assemblywoman Burke.
Thank you, Chairwoman DeLauro, the committee members and their staff for giving me this opportunity to testify before the committee. My name is Autumn Burke, and I'm the California State Assemblywoman representing the 62nd District, an ethnically and economically diverse area of Southern California. California is the 5th largest economy in the world and has the highest rate of child poverty in the nation. 1 in 5 children, or 1.9 million children, live in poverty, equating to almost 1/3 of the African American and 1/3 of the Latino children. Child poverty alone is estimated to cost the U.S. economy more than $600 billion annually in lost productivity, increased health care costs, and higher criminal justice expenditures. High cost of living, income inequality, and the ongoing impacts of institutional and economic racism all contribute to the high poverty rates, not just in our state, but across the country. Historically, efforts to invest in measures to reduce child poverty have been hampered by a lack of sustained focus and defined holistic plan for addressing the problem. In 2017, I partnered with the Grace Institute, and with the introduction of my bill, Assembly Bill 1520, we launched an End Child Poverty in California campaign, and I'd like to thank the Congresswoman Lee for her support of that measure. AB 1520 did away with the traditional budgetary formulations and instead embraced a whole-person approach when considering the needs of those living in poverty. This, in turn, produced an innovative, comprehensive framework of recommendations for the governor and the legislature to consider, with the objective to lift an estimated 1 million children out of poverty in California. AB 1520 received overwhelming support from both sides of the aisle and was signed into law by former Governor Jerry Brown. The 2018 state report served as a foundation for additional legislative efforts that were undertaken this past year. Chief among those was the expansion of the California Earned Income Tax Credit and the creation of a Young Child Tax Credit. Specifically, my bill, Assembly Bill 91, expanded eligibility for the Cal EITC by raising the maximum allowable income to $30,000 a year. This provision dramatically broadened the number of families eligible to receive the Cal EITC. The act also created a brand new $1,000 refundable Young Child Tax Credit for families with children under the age of 6. The work of this task force served as a policy guidance specific to California and was the first of its kind. Since then, more work has been done, both nationally and in other states, the most significant being the 2019 report, A Roadmap to Reduce Child Poverty, by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. The groundbreaking federal study analyzed several poverty reduction policies and, in general, recommended the following programmatic changes: expanding EITC, make the Child Independent Care Tax Credit fully refundable, and concentrate those benefits on families with children under the age of 5, increase SNAP benefits, and increase housing vouchers. While we did not make the California Child Independent Care Tax Credit refundable, as recommended by the federal report, our $1,000 refundable Young Child Tax Credit largely accomplishes the same goal. These changes are expected to deliver about $1 billion to working families, or about 600 more than it did the previous year. As chair of the Revenue and Tax Committee for the State Assembly, I'm acutely aware of the direct impact tax policy has on lives of Californians. However, many of the existing tax benefits that the state and federal government provide are only available to those who file itemized tax returns. Additionally, credits are often not refundable, which means low-income families will receive little or no benefit. It's important that any attempts to address childhood poverty be a combination of federal and state tax policy changes and direct expenditures like increasing SNAP and housing benefits. It must be noted, however, that the fight to end child poverty would fall short in California if it does not address homelessness. California's homeless population has reached over 151,000 people. The vast majority on the streets are not residing in shelters. African Americans are disproportionately affected, making up 6.5% of our total population, but accounting for 30% of our homeless. We can enact new tax policies and make additional expenditures, but we cannot stop the momentum of poverty until we make sure that every child and family has a home. That is why I've introduced Assembly Bill 2405, which would establish a right to housing for children and families in California beginning 2026. Housing should be a fundamental right, like education and having access to clean drinking water. If the only place you are guaranteed a roof over your head in America is a prison, we are failing as a society. In short, I agree with the recommendations made by the National Academies of Sciences. However, there is only so much we can do as a state. If we are going to reach the goals outlined in the study, we're going to need the federal and state governments to take much-needed coordinated action. California has expanded the EITC, it has created the Young Child Tax Credit, and we are working to establish a right to housing. The closer we get to eradicating child poverty, the closer we come as a nation to achieving the prosperity and equity promised to every American. An endeavor such as this requires a partnership between both federal and state government, a partnership that transcends election, partisanship, and term limits. And it's only this way that we can truly end child poverty. Thank you.
Mr. Wettinger?
Thank you, Chairwoman. Chairwoman DeLauro, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is Matt Whitinger. I'm the Rowe Fellow in Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Previously, I spent over 2 decades working for the House Ways and Means Committee with jurisdiction over a number of the policies and programs that are the subject of today's hearing and the NES report. So let me start by recognizing Representative Lee and Representative Roybal Allard for their work leading up to the report and today's hearing. The report is a valuable resource that includes, as we've heard, a number of possible packages, but it also includes tremendous background information about these important issues and how to take a look at them and evaluate them going forward. What I will do is try to review some important lessons from past efforts to reduce child poverty, which offer important context for the roadmap's recommendations. First, reducing child poverty is a goal that taxpayers have contributed significant resources towards addressing. Figure 4.5 in the roadmap displays how annual federal spending on children grew 8-fold in real terms between 1960 and 2010, which the report notes is many times larger than the 15% increase in the child population during that time. So taxpayers contribute significant help. It may not always be as well targeted as we would like, but there is significant assistance that's being provided. Second, as the roadmap notes, recent efforts to reduce child poverty have focused on promoting parental work and earnings and have resulted in sharp reductions in child poverty. The shift from welfare towards work supports generally has been bipartisan, and it's included a number of policies designed to make work pay. Those policies include an expanded EITC, welfare reforms premised on promoting work, and increased child care and extended eligibility for Medicaid for families making the transition to work. Those resulted in the parents who were least likely to be working before welfare reform having the most significant gains in work and earnings in the years immediately after the welfare reform law, which have generally been maintained. As the roadmap notes, rising earnings and work support benefits like those, like the EITC and others, contributed to reductions in child poverty. Here's what the report says. Between 1993 and 2016, the supplemental poverty measure, the measure used by the report, fell by 12.3 percentage points, dropping from 27.9 to 15.6%. That's a substantial 44% decline in child poverty, as the report measures. A third lesson is how we measure poverty matters a lot. The official poverty measure, as the report notes, ignores a growing share of anti-poverty assistance, including the EITC, other tax credits, and various other anti-poverty assistance like SNAP in its count of who is officially poor. Since 1999, spending on benefits that are not counted, the spending that's not counted, has grown 16 times as fast as the spending on benefits that are counted under the official poverty measure. So to its credit, the report uses the supplemental poverty measure that actually takes account of all those benefits and the increased support that has been provided. Using the supplemental measure reduces the child poverty rate from 19.7% under the official measure to 13.0% in 2015. Again, a substantial drop just from using a more accurate measure of what is being provided to help low-income families. That's about 5 million children different between the official poverty measure and the supplemental poverty measure. Fourth, the roadmap includes, as we've heard, several different policy packages, including universal supports, means-tested supports, work-oriented benefits, and so forth. The work-oriented proposals, such as expanding the EITC and adjusting the child and dependent care tax credit, are more consistent with recent efforts to promote work and make work pay. The work-oriented package is also the only package expected to increase earnings more than it increases spending on benefits, which I would say is an important factor. In contrast, means-tested support, universal support proposals such as expanding SNAP and housing benefits, creating a new child allowance payable regardless of parental work, are significantly more expensive, and they also are projected to reduce somewhat employment and earnings. Final lesson is the relative costs of all these packages matter, including for their prospects for enactment. The most expensive package would cost an estimated $109 billion per year, and similar proposals have been made in the past decade and failed to have been enacted. The roadmap doesn't identify potential offsets, and the current fiscal environment, as you all know, is very, very challenging, especially because senior entitlements are going to claim a rising share of the federal budget going forward. So this may cause policymakers looking to pursue some progress using the roadmap's recommendations to seek the more incremental changes whose lower costs and greater consistency with recent successful work support policies could improve their chances of enactment. Outside of the policy packages, the roadmap also proposes more testing of efforts to promote work and strengthen families, like Dr. Besharov suggested, which would be beneficial and also would likely earn bipartisan support. So thank you for the opportunity to testify. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Professor Garfinkel?
Good morning,
Morning.
Chairwoman DeLauro, Ranking Member
Gotcha.
Cole, thank you, and esteemed members of this subcommittee. I was privileged to serve as a member of the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on Building an Agenda to Reduce the Number of Children in Poverty by half in 10 years. Thank you, Representative Lee and Representative Roybal Allard, for your critical role in creating the committee. Professor Avesedo Garcia has summarized the major findings of the report. I'm happy to answer questions about the report, but my testimony focuses on policy and does not represent the committee. I draw on my own research on the benefits and costs of alternative income transfer programs. The committee found 2 program packages that could cut poverty in half. One relies primarily on increases in means-tested benefits, food stamps, and housing subsidies, while the other relies primarily on universal or non-means-tested benefits, primarily child allowances or refundable tax credits. Either package would achieve a great deal of good. The child poverty reduction and fiscal costs of each package are virtually equivalent. The universal approach is, in my judgment, vastly superior in general and specifically for child allowances. What are the benefits of universality? First, human dignity. Means-tested programs benefits stigmatize beneficiaries. If everyone, rich and poor alike, get the benefit, there can be no shame. Universality eliminates stigma. Second, universality promotes social cohesions. Benefits limited to the poor or near poor create a sharp division between beneficiaries and taxpayers. Lower middle-class families who are just barely better off than the near poor are resentful of poor beneficiaries. Universal programs reinforce the notion that we are all in this together. Third, universal programs promote social cohesion by including the poor and the rich in the same programs. And fourth, and most important, universal benefits promote equal opportunity and mobility. Benefits targeted at the poor reduce benefits as income increases. Benefit reductions are equivalent to a tax on income. Means-tested benefits place higher tax rates on the poor and near poor than tax rates faced by the more affluent. This creates what the late Tony Atkinson labeled a poverty trap. You can't earn your way out of poverty or near poverty because benefits are reduced steeply as earnings increase. Universal benefits, by not eliminating benefits as earnings increase, avoid the poverty trap and promote opportunity and mobility. In short, the benefits or virtues of universal benefits are great. What are the costs? The fiscal costs of universal benefits are generally much higher than the fiscal cost of targeted benefits. Indeed, this is the only cost or vice of universal benefits. But as the roadmap report clearly explains, in the case of child allowances in the U.S. today, the extra costs are small. Both the means-tested and universal packages cut poverty in half at about the same cost. Why are child allowances so cheap? Because the U.S. today has a nearly has a $2,000 per child allowance. Most families in the country get $2,000 per year via the federal income tax. The exception are a small group of the very richest families and a much larger group of the poorest families, those with very low or no earnings. Excluding the poorest third of families is both inequitable and unwise. The children in these families will become more productive as citizens, as adults, earning more, paying more in taxes, less likely to commit crime, and less likely to be unhealthy. In short, a child allowance of $2,000 per year is a clear policy winner because it has all of the virtues of universality and none of the extra costs. But increasing the child allowance beyond $2,000 does entail all the extra costs of universality. The lower middle class, the middle class, and even the upper middle class all receive greater benefits from a larger child allowance than they will pay in taxes to finance those benefits. Only those in the top fifth experience higher net cost, with the highest cost experienced by the top 1%. So are the extra costs really a vice? Or in the current context, where inequality is as great as during the Gilded Age and the Roaring '20s, is this vice actually a virtue? This concludes my testimony. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
I now would like to introduce Cheryl Brunson of the Brookland Manor Tenants Association, representative of the DC's Poor People's Campaign. I want to just welcome you, Ms. Brunson. Lived in the Washington, D.C. area her entire life. First time into any building on Capitol Hill. So
Yes.
We're delighted that you're here, and please know that you are always, always welcome.
Thank you. As you said, my name is Cheryl Brunson, and I'm with the Tenant Association at Brooklyn Manor. And it's some things I'd like to touch on, but I would first like to say that I was born and raised here in Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. has been my home forever. And, I just want to say that, Brooklyn Manor is a very family-oriented neighborhood. That's what I pretty much, when you're looking for places to live, you look for certain features. And the features that I saw was that it was very family-oriented. They had adequate place and space for the children to play without being in harm's way. They had a lot of programs that was funded through the police department. And so the police department was running the Girls and the Boys Club, which was awesome because it gave the kids a sense of what they want to be when they grow up and what they could bring to the community when they grow up. And, you know, now I'm currently raising my grandkids. My kids are older. My oldest daughter is 45, and my youngest daughter is 34. My baby is 33. And now I'm currently raising my grandkids because my daughter, she suffers with psychosis, and she's schizophrenic, and she suffers from depression. And she wanders off for days at a time, sometimes weeks at a time. And I have to put out reports and flyers, you know, to see if anybody knows where she at or she's out of harm's way or what have you. And a couple of times we found her on 2nd and D Street at the shelter. She was lost. She couldn't find her way. So that's what we're dealing with. And I have to, like, keep my grandkids pretty much active so that they don't really feel the hardship that they're going through. But, you know, they're putting all these charter schools in low-class neighborhoods, I would say, you know. And, you know, the teachers are not as on hands as it was when I was growing up. You know, they jot some stuff down on the board, da-da-da-da-da, and then the next thing you know, the kids are looking like, well, what do I do? And they're leaving this to other kids in the classroom to put the other kids on point with what's going on in their activities. They don't always get what they need that away because that child may have missed something along the way, you know. So, you know, I'm really fighting because, you know, in our neighborhood, they're jailing us. You know, they're setting our kids up to lock them up. Like if y'all running for the bus, you're not going to have a problem. But if our African-American kids or young adults run for the bus, the police is running after them because they think that he's up to something or they're up to something. They're tackling them down to the ground, macing them. This is true. This is so true. And then we have in our neighborhood, they bought security in our neighborhood as if the police wasn't enough. When they first bought the security in there, they said it was for our safety. And we're looking around, safety from who? Because we're all family here. And what I found out was they brought the security in to harass us, to move us around, to run up on us when we can't sit on our front, we can't lean on the fence, you can't smoke a cigarette out in front of the building. We have to stand in between they say stand in between the tree box. You know what the tree box is? It's the street and the sidewalk. Between the street and the sidewalk, that's where we have to stand at in our community. We have to stand there when we're waiting on our Uber. We have to stand in there when we're waiting on our cabs. We have to stand on there when we're waiting on the bus to get our kids from school. It's disturbing. Take, for instance, this is what Mid-City and these developers are doing to these communities that they are rebuilding, redeveloping, they say. Okay? One of the neighbors passed away. He had a heart attack. He had 3 daughters. One of his daughters was living with him to take care of him because they knew his heart was bad. He passed away. Before they could bury him, Brooklyn Manor was giving them a eviction notice. They wanted him out in 3 days. They couldn't even bury their father in 3 days. Mind you, Douglas Smith worked for Brooklyn Manor. He worked for Brooklyn Manor for almost 12 years in the Boys and Girls Club. I never seen my grandson break down like this and cry a day in my life. Douglas Smith was a martial arts teacher, and he taught the kids in the neighborhood martial arts out of his own money, out of his own time. He did that for the community. They put that man's stuff out on the sidewalk like it was trash. They didn't even give them, the family, enough time to grieve. And I see this constantly. I see this all the time. You know, people have been put out of the community for owing $1. They'll return your money back to you if you $1 short and charge you $25 for being late. Okay? These people, in this community, we have a lot of single parents. We have single fathers, we have single mothers, we have grandparents such as myself raising our kids. And our kids can't even play. They can't even run through the community without being harassed by the security. In our community, if sitting on our front, that's an infraction. Leaning on the fence, that's an infraction.
Ms. Brunson, I hate to interrupt you, but you'll get a chance to maybe continue in the other questions. Everyone's given about 5 minutes to speak so that we can get to the questions. But thank you for the poignant testimony, and I promise you'll get a chance to complete your thoughts and ideas as we move through the questions. Thank you so much for being here. With that, we will start the questioning, and as I mentioned in my opening, my bill, the American Family Act, would give the same full child tax credit to families earning the minimum wage, military families, rural families, families with young kids, all those left behind by the tax bill. It has been endorsed by scholars across the country. It's consistent with the NAS, what they showed us would be the most effective policy to reduce child poverty. Dr. Garfinkel, is the National Academy of Sciences saying that if we had simply extended the child tax credit to the kids who were left behind, we would have drastically reduced child poverty. And in addition to including the left behind children, we also increased the credit to $3,600 for young kids and $3,000 for older kids. What would that additional income do for children and families?
So the committee talked about the costs of child poverty, and it's roughly $1 trillion a year. And those costs come from less the children who grow up in poverty get less education. They're less healthy, so they incur more health care costs. They're less productive as adults, so they earn less and they pay less in taxes, more likely to commit crime. So just the fiscal costs of poverty are quite high. So reducing poverty by, in this case, if you were to have a child allowance of $3,000 and $3,500 for young children, we don't know. It's hard to say that that would exactly cut the costs in half or close to half, but roughly speaking, whatever the reduction in poverty, we should expect that that would translate into a reduction in those costs.
Mm-hmm. Let me just ask you this. Rates of single parenthood in the European Union are about the same as the United States. However, child poverty in the United States is much higher because of policy. It's also, I believe, that single parents get smaller tax credits than married couples because their earnings are lower. And families headed by women get lower tax credits, likely because of pay inequity or other reasons. What is that? I was concerned about the issue of single parenthood and that's effect overall on.
So one of the packages includes a child support assurance, a guarantee of a minimum amount of child support for all those who are legally entitled to private child support. So for low-income families, the men who are the non-resident parents, and I'm speaking in gendered terms here because 85% of children where the parents are separated live with the moms. So the fathers, their pay is low and irregular. And when pay is low and irregular, child support is going to be low and irregular. So the needs of single-parent families are greater than the needs of two-parent families. And one way to address that is to guarantee a minimum amount of child support. Sweden does that. Several other rich industrial nations do that. I've worked on that in my own research. I think would be a very effective policy for addressing single-parent poverty, but you can't make the benefit too big, and that's where a child allowance comes in. A child allowance is general. It doesn't favor single-parent families, but if you have a program that increases the total guarantee, the total security that's available to single-parent families, that would be an effective way of addressing that problem.
Thank you very much. With that, let me yield to my colleague, Mr. Molinar.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing today and also for all the participants. Appreciate that very much. I want to begin with Mr. Weidinger. You had talked about the work-oriented proposals, and you talked about a historical kind of examination of what has worked in the past and kind of guiding us to what might work better in the future. And, you know, I come from a fairly rural district. When you look at farms, small businesses, people are interested in hiring people. There's actually, you know, low unemployment and people looking for employees. So I'm kind of intrigued by sort of the work-oriented proposals that you've identified that have been helpful. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on maybe what we're doing now, but what we might want to do in the future to, you know, help people on the income side as opposed to, you know, just focusing on the one aspect.
Sure. Well, as I recounted my testimony, recent anti-poverty policy history has focused significantly on what are known as work supports, the idea of making work pay, providing individuals with additional money if they're working. And as the NAS report shows, if you count those benefits, if you use the supplemental poverty measure, there has been significant progress in reducing child poverty as a result of that. The report also divides different packages of benefits, and one of them focuses more heavily on basically promoting more of that work orientation. That includes things like growing the EITC, sort of compressing the current child independent care tax credit and making it more generous and more available to lower income folks to help them with child care costs. If you do those sorts of things, if you do more basically of what we have been doing, you will make further progress against poverty. It's not as simple as saying, where we encounter children, and especially low-income children, we will give them a check. It's basically more in line with what most American families experience, which is go to work, have earnings, keep your family out of poverty, and make progress. And fortunately, we also have an economy that's supporting those sorts of things. I'd note the Conference Board recently reported that we're actually in a labor shortage across the country in blue-collar and manual service jobs, and that's where wages are rising fastest. So many of the types of folks that we're concerned about have increased opportunity now, and we should be taking advantage of that and helping them move into those opportunities.
Thank you. And I also wonder, you know, one of the other challenges in my district, the opioid situation, and I think it's across the country, but I wondered if in your studies, kind of how we're addressing that challenge and how that affects child poverty. If any of you want to comment on that.
Many more years ago than I like to think, I was the director of the U.S. National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect in HHS. And in those days, we worried about heroin addiction and its problems that occurred. The opioids are more of an equal opportunity scourge, which is to say, middle class, lower middle class, white, black, Hispanic, not so much Hispanic, are caught up in this. And the consensus is that it's partly because of the stresses and the changes taking place in the American labor force, and also because of something in the air that's just depressed. And it's reflected in our politics, and I won't get too philosophical with the amount of time you have. But it's a giant problem, and in the context of today, to not talk about the drug treatment side, but I was really so moved by Ms. Brunson's testimony, and if you listen to what she was describing, it's not as if an extra $1,000 a year or $2,000 a year, or colleagues, more than that, is going to change the conditions she described, and the same is true with the opioids. There's something deeper going on, and we have to broaden the discussion to get to that. And it's affecting middle-class kids. And just to cap the last point I wanted to make, as a grandmother, she knows one of the big effects of the opioid crisis is, again, the renewal of grandparents coming to the rescue. I was raised by my grandmother, so I'm allowed to say that. It's a terrific resource, but it's not enough for what we have to do. And tax credits aren't going to do it. Sorry.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Congresswoman Lee.
Well, thank you, first of all, Madam Chair, for this really, quite frankly, historic hearing. Really appreciate your leadership, and really, I know your commitment over the years has been to end poverty and child poverty, and so I'm so delighted this comes under your jurisdiction, and I want to thank you very much for this. And I want to thank all of you for being here, and it's very seldom we get to see really the results of our work on this committee, and it was a bipartisan effort. And so here we are, and I really thank all of you for being here today. Let me say to Assemblywoman Burke, you mentioned being the daughter of Congresswoman Yvonne Brathwaite Burke. She was the first woman who was pregnant here on Capitol Hill with Autumn. So you made history, Autumn, before you even arrived. Tell your mother and your dad hello for us. And I'm so proud of the work that you're doing, and you have quite a legacy in your family, but you have stepped up and moved forward in your own right. So thank you again for being here. I wanted to ask, first of all, Assemblywoman Burke, a question with regard to national policymakers, because, yes, you took the lead in California. Let me just mention the Golden State of California, which we represent. My district, of course, Oakland, Berkeley, right next to Silicon Valley. African-American child poverty rates 32%, Latino child poverty rates 25%, Asian Pacific American child poverty rates 16%. Outrageous. It's disgusting. It should not happen anywhere in the country, but especially in California. So what would you suggest that we hear from the work that we learned from your work in California? And then my second question is, thank you, Ms. Brunson, for being here. This is your capital. Welcome. I'm glad you're here for the first time, but many residents of the District of Columbia don't really feel connected to their capital. So maybe you can go back and remind people to come up here as much as they can come. And you laid out the case and painted the picture of what we all understand and know in terms of systemic and institutional racism and what black people live with each and every day. And so there is a relationship between poverty, childhood poverty, and racism. And so, Professor, I'd like for you to kind of comment on that, because we have, of course, the Fugitive Slave Act, the National Housing Act, which refused loans to black people, sharecropping, which tied millions of black people to their former masters. So there's damage that still has to be repaired before we can even complete this work of what the commission has done. So I would like for any of you, especially Professor, to comment on that. But first, Assemblywoman Burke, what should we know as we follow up from your great work in California?
You know, a few things. Obviously, making sure that any tax credit is refundable, but I'd also like to speak to, and earned income tax credits are important. They're an important part of of creating the safety net and making sure there are no holes. However, I would like to address the fact that even in rural communities, I don't come from a rural community, I come from a very urban community, but a lot of my colleagues, the reason they're so supportive of so much of the poverty packages, in rural communities there isn't that consistent work. And so there are times, so many people, not just in California, but across the country, are a week or two away from becoming homeless or falling into poverty. And so it is not always possible to have an earned income tax credit. Those are the holes. Those are the people that fall through the cracks. And so it is important, especially in a rural community where we have some of these other mechanisms where we can make sure that people are taken care of. If you focus solely on an earned income tax credit, refundable or not, you do not create the net that you need to really lift children out of poverty and to stop that constant cycle. So that's the number one thing for us. Obviously, in California, we're having a tremendous homeless issue. We have women in Oakland who have 3 jobs who were homeless and ended up having to take over a house so that they could keep a roof over their children's head. And people ask, how could they do that? But what would you do? What would you do if you were 2 weeks away from losing your home or becoming homeless and having your children on the street? You would fight and do whatever you needed to do to put a roof over your head. And so, although work is important, it's a very vital and part of this. We really support career technical education and making sure that those who have not had a chance to get a college education or community college education have an opportunity to do that. And that is all part of looking at a whole human. But we cannot only look at earned income tax credits. But when we do, they need to be refundable.
Professor, could you talk a little bit about repairing this damage that underlies
Real fast.
all of this? Okay, real fast.
So I think the debate in this country between left and right has gotten a little confused on part of this. People on the right tend to think, well, it's a different country. I quoted John Lewis. It is a different country from 50 years ago, but it's not a whole country. And that's what he was careful to say. That was what President Obama was careful to say, which is we've made progress, there's more to make. Some of the proposals that you described, Congresswoman Lee, I think are very needed. I was in Mississippi in 1968 doing civil rights work, and what we found was the U.S. Department of Agriculture basically didn't give farm aid to African-American farmers. Now, that was our government. Now, there are loads of other programs like that. But the average person on the right doesn't know that history and thinks this is 2020. Hey, you guys have the vote, excuse me to being a little, flippant about it. There, all's fine. So there is a history, and my advice, if whatever it's worth, besides all this other stuff, is to systematically study the effects of this very recent discrimination, some of it that continues. Now, I don't think it's all just racial discrimination. I think there's good old economics going on for some of the stuff, and I don't want to sound as if I'm only on one side of this argument, but it is truly the case that if people understood all the obstacles created by government for African Americans in every state of the union, they'd be much more amenable to some kind of corrective action. And I think public education is the first step.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I just might add, Bassaroff, that not only did they discriminate against African Americans, they discriminated against Hispanic farmers, and they discriminated against women farmers who never did get any recompense for their work. Well, now we're out of time here, but we'll get back to you. Okay. Let me now yield to Congressman Harris.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Weidinger, I read your submitted testimony with interest. I read the report with interest. My understanding is that if you look at the discrepancies between two-parent families and single-parent families, that the poverty rate is 22% with a child poverty rate, 22% two-parent families, 9% single-parent families. If you look at non-working households, 62% non-working households poverty rate, 7% full-time work poverty rate. It seems that if you're looking for a strategy to have the number of people in poverty, that it's glaring that you should address these, and yet I think I'm struck by how the roadmap pays only little attention to that. It pays some, but little. So I'm going to ask you, do you believe that instituting family support policies, and other countries have done it, institute policies that encourage families, encourage two-parent families, and the encouragement of, and I mean being serious about a goal of every able-bodied American being trained for a job, have a job. Where do those fit into what your roadmap would be?
Sure. So you're right, those statistics are from the roadmap, and they reflect on sort of the reality that Dr. Besheroff was saying, that the roadmap was given a charge of saying, within 10 years, how are we going to lift half of children out of poverty, right? The simplest way to do that, and as Dr. Garfinkel reflected, the most powerful way to do that is simply to provide a cash transfer to those households. It's sort of on the order of math, right? Somebody's low income, if you want to give them food today or cash or whatever that is, they're going to be less low income, less likely to fall below some threshold of deep poverty or poverty in general. What the roadmap doesn't do as much of, and I would argue that some of our government programs currently don't do enough of, is focus on the bigger picture, which is, why is the person low income? What can we do to help them go to work? What can we do to raise their income from work, their earnings? We don't tend to hold programs accountable for success in that. What little we know about the actual outcomes of programs is most are unsuccessful when they try to do that. So in some sense, what the roadmap provides is a challenge to current programs to do a better job in those things that we know are successful in most of our households in keeping people out of poverty. The roadmap has a very specific and narrow charge that's different from that, but I don't think that should distract us from the broader, sort of more whole view that you're reflecting on.
Well, what do you, look, this is a problem that's been around a while. And look, in my opinion, the Great Society failed. We've spent trillions of dollars, and we still have significant number of people who are in poverty. So I understand that the charge was, look, how do we do this within 10 years? But this is a generational problem, and is probably going to look for a generational solution. So two specific questions. One is, what policies do we have right now that actually discourage two-parent families? And what policy should we look for if we're going to do generational change and we're going to create an expectation and make available policies that would provide for training and employment? What would they look like?
So policies that discourage two-parent families are things like the earned income tax credit. So if you're a single low-income person and you marry another low-income person, you may be bumped out of the range where you collect the EITC. That's a payment that's available today that can be up to $6,000 per person. If you're not collecting, that's a pretty significant change. That may also knock out things like childcare, food stamps, housing benefits, you name it, depending on the nature of the family. So we have programs that by their design include work disincentives, but the most pervasive of that, the most powerful of all that is the disincentives to work when you're basically adding a whole nother earner to your household. In terms of functional things to do to change, I think we should hold programs more accountable for actually being successful in their outcomes. And that goes for things like the TANF program, right? The TANF program was supposed to be about moving people from welfare to work. It gave states tremendous flexibility. It also said states need to make a contribution on their own to support the costs and the effort of all that. And what we found is in many states, states have basically defunded their state side, and they have absolved themselves through sort of rhetorical or sort of mathematical gymnastics of the expectation of engaging people in work. We need to reinvigorate those sorts of efforts. So we're actually encountering the types of folks that Dr. Ethan suggested want to work, and with a little bit of help, could go to work.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Congressman Pocan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks for the panel. This was very interesting, and there's so much that you could cover, but I'm going to try to cover one subject area if I can, just because it's related directly to appropriations. And I understood the tax credits were not going to do it all. I understand that line, but let me talk specifically about the SNAP program, because it came up by so many folks. And I've done the home visits of people, the new mothers, and seen the despair and the conditions, empty, I can't even call apartments, but very small living quarters. But on SNAP, when I first came here, I got elected in 12. That first session, a number of us lived on SNAP for a week. The benefits at that time were about $31.50 a week. And I remember going to the grocery store, and I bought a bag of oranges, and that took up the biggest chunk of my SNAP benefit. Then I bought my ramen noodle soup, bought my peanut butter, my bread, and a few other things. And at the end of the week, my office told me I was pretty cranky because I wasn't getting that much food, and certainly not that much healthy food at all, even at that $31.50. Since then, the benefit now, only because we gave it a boost in the last appropriations process, is around a little over $29. a week. So we're actually down in real dollars, not even inflation dollars. Inflation since then, when I did that, was 10.7%. So it should be, if it was at that 31.50, it should have been about 34.88. We're about 15% down in real dollars from when I came in 2013 in that program. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Because I find it pretty amazing. I was always told that's the #1 program to keep a kid out of poverty. And yet, you know, here we are fighting, struggling to keep it in. And I have a lot of ag areas in my district. I want to see all these ag bills get done. And yet, over and over, SNAP becomes this philosophical fight that I don't get, because maybe because I did it for a week and I saw how little you could actually buy with that amount. But could you just address that one program in particular? And Professor Eden, I think you brought it up first, so thank you.
So I've studied SNAP with the USDA, talked to hundreds of households using SNAP about what they use it for, when they run out. I could summarize my research by saying in the last last week and a half, families run on ramen. In fact, in one study I did, I was amazed at the number of ramen recipes. Of course, ramen's not great for your health, that I collected. But we often think about SNAP as sort of, well, at least they have SNAP, as if cash doesn't matter. I mean, one of the reasons that I have been so enthusiastic about the American Family Act is it actually provides this critical resource of cash. SNAP is actually intended to run out. It's not intended to cover your entire month. Families don't recognize this. They tend to, at the first of the month, spend all of their money on their other bills, leaving nothing for food. So it's a big problem. It leaves children hungry. And of course, we've documented this rise in $2 a day poverty, where families really have no cash and only SNAP. And in those cases, it is the only semi-fungible resource they have. And so if you're spending $600 in SNAP, as Alva May Hicks did in South Carolina, in Mississippi, just to pay your light bill, getting $300 in return, your kids are going to be very, very hungry. It's a great issue. It's one that's, I think, really is under the radar, but it is probably why, or one of the reasons why, we see an increase over time, even in this economy, in very low for food security. So families are feeling it, and they're especially feeling it in the last week and a half of the month.
Yeah, and actually, Ms. Brunson, you're nodding your head, so can you share your experience?
Yes. I would say, like with SNAP, as Ms. Catherine said, it's definitely not enough to for the kids to, be able to eat. And I tell you, a lot of these kids are looking forward to school. They're going to school so that they can get those meals. And my granddaughter, personally, every Friday, she brings home a bag from school, and it helps. It really does help. They call it a welcoming bag. It's a bag of food that she brings home every Friday. And, it actually have, like, the little snacks in it, like little Debbie's and stuff like that, little juices and that kind of thing. And they give her about 2 or 3 so she can share it with her brothers, or other people in the household. But if it wasn't for that, I'm telling you, I wouldn't be able to make it. I would not be, and I thank God for ramen noodles, because I'm telling you, the stamps go so quick. It's, to me, it's like, whereas though $50 would make at least 3 to 4 meals a week, it's only making 2 now, because everything is going up. And just the other day I was in the store shopping, and I'm looking around, I'm like, oh my gosh, everything in here is so, they're going up. It just seems like everything is just sky high. And so, I make a lot of soups, I make a lot of stews, and I have this one particular one that kids say, what is it? I say, oh, this is my penny soup. That means that I used every penny I had to make that soup. And they enjoy it. You have to come up with names and stuff like that so that the kids will eat it. But most of the time, the kids, and I know in my neighborhood, they're barely eating. So I try to buy enough snacks so that I can share with them as well. It's really hard.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Congresswoman Clark.
Thank you very much. I truly appreciate this hearing today and thank all of you for joining us. It's so hard to capture all your stories and expertise in 5-minute segments, but here we go. I really want to focus on trauma and how that plays into kids in poverty and has lifelong effects. And Assemblywoman Burke, we know that childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences can have immense impact on adulthood, including one's ability to hold a job, physical health, higher rates of diabetes and other physical conditions. I have been very impressed with California's effort to begin screening. I'm also very impressed with your State Surgeon General, Dr. Burke, and her focus on this with the ACE scores for children. Can you comment on the importance of that screening and how California intends to support students and children who have those high scores?
So we found, obviously, in California that, and I'm sure everyone here is aware, that African American women are struggling the most from things like miscarriages, fertility issues, and a lot of that studies have shown is a result of stress. And that starts the most beginning level of implicit bias and not being, and that stress that creates in a woman as she's having a baby, and poverty in creating that stress as well. And so I think that as a legislature, I think we've become extremely aware of not just how that affects a woman as she's giving birth, but as the children are born. Malnutrition, obviously, as we have heard Cheryl talk about today, malnutrition makes it very difficult for children to learn, almost impossible. And as a legislature, I think we're starting to take that and Dr. Burke's studies and research very seriously and her work very seriously. We have not legislated on it as of yet, but I think that you will definitely see, especially the Black Caucus has made infant mortality one of our #1 priorities for the year. And that is really based on, after some of our research and some of our work with her coming to the caucus, saying that a lot of that is the effect of implicit bias and the things that the women have taken on that we have not acknowledged as a state or a country.
Thank you. And Professor Acevedo Garcia, I know that you have done work in this. Can you tell me about how you see anti-poverty measures actually being able to help in the connection between reducing trauma in children?
Sure. Thank you for that question. So, of course, child poverty in itself is a very significant adverse childhood experience. So by implementing any of the measures that the committee concluded would be effective in reducing child poverty, we would reduce the prevalence of ACEs, because child poverty is a major ACE. In addition to that, and I want to acknowledge Professor Besharov for his comments about the importance of race and racism and discrimination, we also know that there are many other stressors that affect families in addition to poverty. And one way in which the committee considered this is by examining the contextual factors that influence poverty. And by that we mean factors that exacerbate the experience of poverty or the negative effects of poverty, and also may influence the impact of anti-poverty policies. We consider things like discrimination in housing and employment and in the criminal justice system. We also consider the effect of adverse neighborhood conditions. Although we were not able to incorporate these in the simulations, we review very carefully the evidence that these factors tend to worsen the experience of poverty among children and also can limit the effectiveness of anti-poverty programs. I think it's very important to recognize that we can make anti-poverty programs better. We acknowledge that we also have to deal with these contextual factors, again, your comment, and we can do both at the same time. So I'm going to give one example of that is very close to my interest and my research. We know that minority children, specifically Black and Latino children, are more likely to live in poverty than other children. Also, among poor children, Black and Latino children are much more likely to live in neighborhoods of very low opportunity. Just to give you a sense of the extent of the problem, about 2/3 and half of poor Black and Latino children, respectively, live in very low opportunity neighborhoods. 20% of white children who are poor live in very low opportunity neighborhoods. So although, of course, the experience of poverty is very bad for all children, Latino and Black children are also dealing with a lot of problems in their neighborhoods. And I really resonated with your comments in that sense. So we have a program, the Section 8 voucher program, that is an income subsidy to buy housing, but we can make it more effective by helping families, and we have programs that are doing this around the country, housing mobility programs, that would help a family that has a Section 8 voucher to achieve a better neighborhood. And that way, that's the thing, is a very concrete example of how we can tackle both poverty and ACEs or multiple hardships at the same time if we are smart about how we use our programs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me also, Dr. Acevedo-Garcia, I want to just look at what the study showed, that work requirements are at least as likely to increase and decrease poverty. I just would mention that in Arkansas, 18,000 individuals were kicked off of the state's Medicaid program because of work requirements, and the employment rate dropped among Medicaid-eligible Arkansans. Kentucky's work requirement was forecasted to force at least 95,000 Kentuckians to lose coverage. Their new governor, Andy Beshear, has withdrawn the state's work requirement waiver. I would like to give you the opportunity to respond to that assertion that work requirements are at least as likely to increase as decrease poverty. If you can.
Yes, it's very important to understand how a committee like our Committee of National Academies works. For us, everything is driven by research evidence and the strength of the evidence.
Right.
So the criteria that we used to identify programs included the strength of the evidence on how they improve child outcomes, their likelihood to reduce child poverty, and other factors such as cost, as well as the importance of values that we held as a nation, like social inclusion or work. In regard to work requirements, we did examine the evidence extremely carefully, and we concluded that there is no evidence at this point to support that work requirements as part of social programs that are aimed at reducing poverty would help reduce poverty. So we did not include this approach in our policy simulations of either individual policies or packages because the evidence did not sustain including them.
Mm-hmm. And we can have access to what that evidence is because, as you know, we are in an environment where there is a very big focus on work requirements as it pertains to the SNAP program and other programs, and where people are in real danger unless we can answer this question, which is why I just wanted to bring it up again. Did you want to say something, Dr. Garfield?
Yes. So the evidence that's usually advanced for the efficacy of work requirements is the welfare reform, the 1996 welfare reform.
Right.
And most scholars would say perhaps about 1/3 of the increase in earnings was due to the welfare reform, but you have to understand that welfare reform was not just work requirements, and probably even more important was the lifetime limits on eligibility for assistance, and there were lots of other elements as well. So citing that evidence is very weak for saying the efficacy of work requirements. We do have experimental evidence on the efficacy or lack thereof in terms of reducing poverty on work requirements. So there were two different experiments, one in Canada, one I think in Minnesota, that we cite in the report. And the evidence from both is that work requirements increased work, but had no effect on poverty. None, zero, zip. And that's because people that were kicked off welfare lost the welfare benefit, and their earnings just made up for the loss in benefits. That's experimental evidence. The last point, we were well aware at the very end of our deliberations of what happened in Arkansas. I think it was Arkansas.
Arkansas, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And the evidence there is pretty clear. So, and we have lots of other evidence that work requirements have been instituted in a way that simply kicks people off welfare. I say this as being an advocate 25 years ago of not a work requirement, a broader requirement that all recipients of welfare should have a social responsibility to either work or do something to improve their own situation. I'm an optimist, a great optimist. My wife likes to say I'm the greatest optimist she's ever met. So I thought that that could work, that we could implement such a requirement in a decent way, and when someone was having trouble getting to work, that would be a sign to us that person needs help. That's not what happened.
I would just add to that, and my colleagues bear with me, I can recall that debate very, very well. On the floor of the House, there was an amendment that passed which cut, I think, $25 million from the food stamp program. And in fact, there were no wraparound services that were provided at all with the welfare bill about getting to work, about what you do about child care, what you do about any of these other areas that would facilitate a person's ability to be able to get to work and so forth. And so we started behind the curve there. And I am proud to have voted against it. So I just use that as...
Madam Chair, could I just add one? The idea that we would work test Medicaid is just, I don't get it. I just don't get it. It seems to me like such a bad idea that Medicaid, medical care increases people's health. The idea that we would try and kick people off that program because they're not working, they may be on the program because they can't work. And the administrative complications of enforcing the work test in Medicaid.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to follow up on this discussion we're having on work, because I fundamentally believe that there is dignity in work and that it's good for people. And when you think about generation after generation, I think there's real value in children seeing a parent or parents working and realizing that's sort of, as to your point of social responsibility. I wondered, Mr. Whitinger, you had commented in your testimony that some of the impressive gains made against poverty after the 1996 reform continue to support promoting more work and earnings by parents as the better and more enduring solution to poverty. And that intuitively makes sense to me. Although I also am sympathetic with the idea that if you get to a certain point in your income and then you lose all the other supports, that may be a disadvantage. And so I wondered if, I'm sure you've looked at that sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, but that ratio, and maybe there are ways we could improve that so that people wouldn't be penalized for working, but would also have the incentive to work.
Right. So just to follow up on the previous conversation, the work requirements in TANF or in other programs, but I know TANF best, so I'll speak to those. There's actually 12 definitions of work. So it's not, we're going to kick you off if you don't have a job. It is a progressive state, a smart state would say, how can we help Dr. Eden's person go to work by providing the supports that she needs to go to work, right? And in effect, the TANF law permitted that to to be the case. How states actually implemented that is a different thing, right? So I would tend to agree with Dr. Garfinkel that some of this sort of in its translation to policy at the state level has devolved in a direction that the original law didn't really intend. It let the states somewhat off the hook for doing the type of engagement that we know is helpful to people to lifting their income and helping them escape poverty. On the question of sort of the backside transition, Dr. Beshoff sort of made reference to this on the phase-outs and some of the penalties. There is, I would refer you to a chart by Gene Sterling at the Urban Institute. It is a crazy quilt of the marginal tax rate effect of the phase-out of welfare, the welfare package that many people receive. SNAP phases out one way, housing phases out another way. Child care may have a cliff. The earned income tax credit phases up, is level, and then starts to phase out. All of those things can create marginal tax rate effects that in the $20,000 to $30,000 income range for households create a marginal tax rate that's much like that applies to taxpayers in the $200,000 and $300,000 range. Because one day they're receiving a package of benefits, but the next day if they get a raise, and heaven forbid that you marry and bring a second earner into the household, all of a sudden that benefit package goes away. So there are ways to try to address that and fix that. Typically what they tend to do is sort of do the taper more, so have the phase out be lower. That tends to raise the income eligibility for those benefits. It increases costs. There are other things that you can contemplate doing. You could sort of hold people harmless for those phase-outs for a period of time, give them a couple of years, something like that to help them transition to work, maybe get a raise, develop more skills and things like that. So there are policy options for addressing those sorts of things.
Congressman Molinar, I know that Professor Eden wanted to respond, but I'll give you extra time if you have different other questions. Yes.
So I wanted to respond to both your comments about work and about family structure. In terms of work, if we look at the survey of income and program participation, we find that among children in a spell of living in a virtually cashless household, during that year, 70% will have an adult that works. And the figure is 90% for other low-income children. So there's a high degree now of engagement, even among low-income mothers with very young children, in work. I think that's good news. What we showed in our book, $2 a Day, is it's much more the challenge of keeping people in very low-wage jobs in work because of all the challenges of an increasingly perilous low-wage labor market. So Matt has talked about factors that discourage marriage. I have done a literature review with Sarah McClanahan, my colleague at Princeton, about what we know about what enhances marriage rates, especially among low-income parents. The work of Christina Gibson Davis has shown that if you give an unmarried couple a small additional increase in resources, this is through earnings, if their economic situation improves, they are much more likely to marry. So maybe a child tax credit won't do it all, but an additional $5,000 to $6,000 in a household could easily increase family stability a lot. We also know that investments in excellent pre-K, 40 years later, show families with much greater family stability and fathers much more likely to live with their children and have raised them in their own household. We also see evidence from career academies. This program not only raises wages 8 years later, but it dramatically increases family stability, especially for men. So I think what we know about these days, right, about how to get young people to marry, especially low-income young people, is to support them from pre-K all the way through to college graduation. And even small increases in their economic stability have been shown to quite dramatically increase their family stability.
Thank you. That really gets to the issue of, well, you're dealing with a child tax credit. And which I said at the outset, it is not the jurisdiction of this committee, though we're very supportive of this effort, and as well as what are the programs that are within this jurisdiction, which is pre-K and worker training and all of these other areas would come directly under our jurisdiction, that we need to meld those together. Congresswoman Lee.
Thank you very much. Let me, first, to Dr. Eden, in your book, $2 a day living on almost nothing in America, you lay out the personal testimonies and survival strategies that Americans live in extreme poverty. Let me ask you, with regard to the pre-existing Aid to Families with Dependent Children program and its relationship to lifting children out of poverty and the new welfare reform program under TANF. Now, personally, okay, I was on AFDC for years, but I could go to college also, and I was able to take care of my kids and finish college, get my master's degree. Now, when I was in the legislature, the welfare reform program came, through the states, and I chaired the subcommittee that crafted a lot of the supportive services as it relates to welfare reform. But we couldn't get rid of these work requirements that were put into place. And a person like myself couldn't have continued to go to school because of the work requirements. So so I voted against it. I think that was the worst thing Bill Clinton ever did, quite frankly. So let me just ask you how you see that right now in the Academy's report. I don't know if you addressed this specifically, but these work requirements now for young women especially who want to go to college and who want to take care of their families and earn a better income, what's the deal with that in terms of lifting children out of poverty? And then to Assemblymember Burke, where is California now on our welfare on TANF and any of the terrible provisions that were put in early on? First Dr. Eden and then Assemblymember Burke.
So TANF has a couple of problems. One is that benefit levels have the real value of the benefit, even though in many states you just can't get on the rolls. Even if you did, in Mississippi, you'd still live in $2 a day poverty. I believe it's in 17 states. You're below 20% of the poverty level if you get the full benefit. I believe it is in the majority of the states where you're under 30% of the poverty level. Some states this last year raised their benefits for the first time, but it's still a dramatically reduced benefit. This means that people have to work under the table to survive. And so even if they were able to go to college, it would be much harder to do so because they're doing hair, they're selling their plasma, they're babysitting for neighbors' kids. Some of them are picking up tin cans on the sidewalk for about $1, the return of about $1 an hour. I mean, people are really, if you pay people 20% of the poverty line and you believe the poverty line is too low, how do we think people get by? And so I think there's that story of when people fall so low, when benefits decrease on average in value by a third since the late 1990s, it's the early 1990s. That's an additional point to the work requirements actually pushing people often into low-wage work, short-term training, which earns them poverty-level wages. But I'd love to hear what's happening in California.
Yeah, so we're still, I've been working on this for a few years. We're trying to extend the time clock eligibility requirements for CalWorks from 48 to 60 months. And we're also trying to make sure that non-core activities like job training can maintain your participation. It's been a struggle, I'll be honest with you. We've been working on, I think I've done this bill 3 times now, or a version thereof, 3 times. It is one of the great challenges. It's, there are non-core activities that you need to do, and there are non-core things you need to do to be employed. Whether that is, I'm a single mother, so we keep talking about single mothers, and I'm a Black single mother sitting here, and I know that, and I have a good job, and I have a good career, but I struggle with childcare, and I've had to try to find time and space to continue my education. It is not easy, and as a state, we're still working on it. We still have further to go in that, and understanding that not getting a job is not as easy as some of the folks seem to think it is here, especially as an African American or African American woman. It's just there are a lot of hurdles, and there are a lot of hurdles for people in my district. For most people, don't realize 70% of students in California enter a high school, never see a community college or a 4-year university. What happens to those 70% of young people? And they live in my district. And yet it's $25,000 or $26,000 to make sure a 2-bedroom apartment. It's $70,000 for a child. For the LAO has said the LA County, it's $70,000 to pay for a child in foster care. This is basic math.
Basic, yeah.
It really is. It's $90,000 to incarcerate one man for a year. This is not, this is basic math, but it is not a basic issue. It really does require that we look at a whole human being, and that is from the implicit bias of an African American or Latino trying to enter the workforce or trying to enter an educational facility. It is about making sure that CalWORKs is extended so that people can get the training and the education they need while they still can do their non-conforming activities. This is a complex issue, and to minimize it to just the basic ability of going to work. People want to work. I believe that that's I believe it is socially equitable, and I think it does give people pride, but it is not that simple.
Congresswoman Clark.
Thank you. To pick up on that theme, I often think of the Boston Globe report that came out a few years ago on the median net worth of families in Boston. Black families, it is $8. White families, it was $247,000. They had to reprint those numbers because everyone thought that $8 had to be a mistake. And when we talk about the dignity of work, and I would ask you, Professor Eden, if you could repeat the statistics of how many people are working on TANF and other. Did you say it was upwards of 70%?
So for what we did is we followed children in the SIP over a year. And turns out it's easier to follow children because family structures are so unstable. And we found that even among children experiencing at least a 3-month spell of extreme poverty, having no income in the house, 70% of those children had an adult who had worked. Yeah. So we see that at 90% among other low-income children. Since the early 90s, the penetration of work in the lives of poor households, poor single moms, is just astonishing. You know, back when I first started doing this in the early 1990s, I'm getting older, mothers really thought there was should I work? I'm not sure that's good for me as a mother, and I'm not sure that's good for my kids. And now mothers will say, of course I should work. How else do I model the value of education to my children? Yeah. So people work. One of the things that was so striking in our research for $2 a day was the level of identification with work. I'm a worker. This is who I am. So work needs to live up to those aspirations that are held by low-income families.
That is an incredibly powerful statement. I think part of the problem with these work requirements is that it sets up a false paradigm that people are not working out of choice because they're getting a handout from the government, when actually I think we need to be focusing on exactly what all of you are advocating. And Mr. Weidinger, when we talk about accountability in these programs, and we all want that, I think we also need to be looking at accountability of our systems. Are we paying women equally for equal work? Are we insisting on a minimum wage that actually allows families to survive? Are we addressing in a realistic way systematic racism, systemic racism, and the toxic vestiges we have of slavery? Are we looking at voter suppression? All of these issues come together, and they've really been drawn into focus for me this week with the coronavirus. How are we going to make sure that we are able to keep Americans safe when there are people who do not have paid sick leave, who cannot afford to stay home from the job or multiple jobs they have that are allowing them to hold on? How are we going to be able to mitigate and have therapies for people who are sick if they are immigrant communities and afraid to come forward and get health care, or they have no insurance or are underinsured? As we see tests for this coming in the range of thousands of dollars in billing for patients who've needed to access testing. So all of these policies are not just a theory and a feel-good. And we have to wrestle with this in a comprehensive way. And when we talk about the dignity of work, we have to make sure that those workplaces, those salaries are really giving people a chance. And I could go on forever, but I won't. But I just want to thank you for your work, Mrs. Brunson, for being here today and sharing your personal experience. It's always people. And we all know how we feel about our grandmothers. And I miss mine every day. But we've got to look at kids and say we can do better in this country. And it's the connection for all of us is so very important. And so thank you for your work. Thank you all for being here. And thank you for having this hearing.
I think the one thing that struck me, Professor Eden, when you were speaking is, we all identify ourselves by our jobs. And I think so many of us, and I just say this widespread, that oftentimes we just hear folks denigrate people who have fallen on hard times, who do not have a job, but looking for jobs. If you go to any of the Workforce Alliance boards and you see people at those computers looking for jobs, people identify who they are by their job. I don't care who you are. And so when you don't have a job, the stigma of that for your own personal self-confidence, and you're a role model as a parent, where how do you explain to your children that you don't have a job? So the notion that somehow that people are dogging it, that they don't want to work, it really is humiliating and denigrating to individuals and what their lives are about and what their set of values are about. I want to, by the way, nobody's on the clock here. I just thought we'd just have a conversation. But I do want to bring up, because this is important, we're dealing with a budget that this administration has put forward. And I'm asking everyone here. It requests to eliminate or block grant more than 50 programs that benefit children and their families. That includes preschool development grants, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP, the Community Service Block Grant Program, foster youth programs, among others. It makes egregious cuts to Medicaid, to the CHIP program, and to TANF. Now, we can sit here and say all those things are not going to happen, but some of them are going to happen. And so what I really do, let me just open this up. What is the impact that these kinds of cuts will make on whether it's California or other places? What happens when there are no longer the investments in preschool slots, childcare slots, workforce homelessness programs, apprenticeship programs, internship programs that deal with 70% of the people in this country who do not have a four-year liberal arts degree? Let me just, just throw it open here. What happens when we're faced with a budget like that? Go ahead.
I think Matt could also, I think this is a point of agreement between us. What we know from the TANF block grant is that if you give block grants and you don't really supervise them, so to speak, you create really a race to the bottom. And governors have been using the TANF block grant as a fungible stream of income for pet projects. So we see in Michigan, we're giving away college scholarships to middle-class students. In Louisiana, we're supporting crisis pregnancy centers. It is true that many states fund their state-level EITCs through TANF, but that, again, goes to the working poor and not the categorically needy, as you were saying. It misses a large chunk of families who are the most needy. So, also in reflection to Matt's remarks, only 8% of current TANF dollars are going to job training. How could a proposal that was supposed to support job training, job placement, be spending so little on the program? So I would say what is going to, and by the way, only of the $16.5 billion, only a tiny fraction now is going to cash benefits. So most states are figuring out ways to basically siphon off most of the money. And I think that's what we could expect in the future. That's our most current model.
So since you raised the budget, I'd advise you to think about this even more broadly. I included in my testimony summation of the coming investments expected in the next decade, prepared by the Pete Peterson Foundation, and found that for every dollar of spending that we'll do above our current levels, we'll spend 67 cents of that on senior entitlements. We'll spend 3 cents of that on children. So, I don't need to tell you as appropriators, you are feeling the squeeze of the broader budget issues that we're facing as a country with, some of this is demographics, it's understandable, it's the way it is, but I think everybody on this panel can agree that children's programs are under increasing pressure because of the broader budget dynamics that we're facing as a country. And until we actually deal with those, these programs will continue to be under pressure.
Well, I just would say this too, Mr. Weidinger, and I appreciate, and and in your testimony, you talk about using the supplemental poverty measure in session, where we go and what we do. But we literally do not focus on, and I just have to say this in response, is that we provided the biggest tax cut to the richest 1% of the people of this country. We did that in 2017 without, in an immediacy. We're not thinking about a deficit. We're not thinking about anything else. And where we go all the time when we think of what economic pressure we have, we focus on seniors as we contrast them with kids. Let's look at the top of the list here and find out who the beneficiaries, the real beneficiaries are of our current policies. And when we can get to leveling that playing field, then we will have the kind of money that we need and the resources that we need to make sure that our kids are taken care of and that our seniors can retire and have health care and a decent way of life. It's not you. I'm not shooting the messenger here. I just get so frustrated with the notion that we never take up what happens at that level. Dr. Garfinkel, Professor Garfinkel.
So if it's okay, I want to come back to the importance of cash for a moment.
Fine.
Because
I always think of that's important as well.
So,
Yeah. Get you guys.
so as a long-run matter, capitalism is the best system we know for reducing poverty. But capitalism creates economic insecurity by its nature, and that has gotten worse recently as the labor market has changed and gotten more insecure. And several people have said, gosh, just what would $2,000 or $3,000 or $5,000 or $6,000 do to, how would that improve the lives of families with low income with children? And the answer is, it creates a base, a secure base, and it reduces economic insecurity, most especially at the bottom, but I can tell you it extends well above the bottom. The most important finding that come out of the Poverty Tracker study in New York City, which is a random sample of the whole city, is only about 20% of the population is poor in any given year. If you look over 4 years, it's close to half. And for those people who aren't, some of them who aren't poor, some who are poor, measures that we call hardship, but I like to think of them as economic insecurity. Things like not going to a doctor because you couldn't afford it, running out of money to buy food, not being able to pay your housing, so you're possibly, in the worst case, thrown out of your housing, not being able to pay bills, electric bills, getting your heat turned off. Those kinds of insecurities in any given year in New York City, it's like 30%. And over the period of 4 years, it's closer to 60. It's above 50%. If we can find a way to stabilize the incomes, which child allowances would do, that's a huge contribution, not just to the poor, but to the lower middle income, to the near poor, etc. Capitalism will do the work in the long run so long as we share the fruits of the capitalist system.
I know my colleagues want to get into this, but you had a comment you want to make, Dr. Besheroff,
So,
and then we'll get both of you.
I just
and
want to
Catherine.
point out, so I think many of us would agree with the kinds of things that you said, Chairwoman, but let me point out the following. We have this big, long report about ideas to reduce poverty, and most of the programs you described that you were feeling so angry about being proposed to be defunded didn't make it into the report. Now, right? Well, no. So to me, I'll just close this in a minute or two. All right. So the challenge is both to make those programs that you listed work better and to get the American people to believe they work better. I mean, I can tell you the consensus about job training programs is don't do them, right? Among the technical people who look at this. Yes, and the committees here aren't very excited about putting money in job training either. So, and I didn't see a big recommendation to increase job training in the report either, because their requirement was to look at the research and say what works. Now, I was against that requirement. I think you should try all these things, but the necessary product, and I know it's politics, I can't help here, but the necessary part of the answer to what you said, I would say, is we have to improve those programs so that the American people believe more in them. Sorry.
Everybody believes in the LIHEAP program. I'm sorry, Mr. Besheroff, and boom, it's been eliminated. Go ahead, Dolores, and then Barbara, Catherine, and Loretta.
Sorry, just very quickly, because I'm obviously here to represent the committee.
Right.
So we did examine work training, and we did include one promising program work advance in one of the packages. You are right that we did not look into other programs. Part of the reason, as everyone knows, is that the task was to look at programs that could reduce poverty within 10 years. So it's important to clarify that. In regard to block grants, it's very important that we did examine whether they may be able to reduce poverty. We look at the evidence carefully, and the evidence is not there to support that block grants could reduce poverty. And actually, the discretion that they give to states could very well work in the opposite direction. We have been holding different sessions around the country to disseminate the report. In Boston, we had one that was focusing specifically on the intersection between child poverty and racial and ethnic equity. One of our presenters has conducted very powerful research that shows that block granting the TANF program, one of the things that it's done, as many people here know, is that it has increased the percent of funds that go to the other category. That is not childcare and other things that are legitimate uses, but the other category. And one of the things that he found is that states in which the caseload has a higher proportion of African American clients are more likely to be using the other category. Again, reinforcing this idea that we have to be looking at these issues simultaneously. It's not only child poverty, but it's issues of racism that are very much present in our society.
You know, and thank you all again for being here, and wanted to just say a couple things. First of all, child poverty rates right now constitute for me a state of emergency. It has so many different layers. You talk about systemic racism. You talk about early childhood development. You talk about children, homeless children. I mean, in terms of just the ability for them to have a stable address and how do they go to school and going to 5 and 6 schools a year and moving around. I mean, the next generation of children who are living now below the poverty line are going to have a very difficult time just negotiating living in America. And so I'm at the point now where I'm saying, and I'm glad Andrew Yang mentioned this several times during his campaign, of going back to a guaranteed annual income, something that will help stabilize this state of emergency until we figure this whole policy thing out. Because I'm so worried at this point that this country is becoming a country again of it's two countries, one that is below, that is unequal, and the other that is just off the scale in terms of the 1%, in terms of the money and the greed in many respects that now we see on each and every level. And so we've got to somehow, and I don't want to see another 20 years go by and more kids falling into poverty without something dramatic, and it's something that's outside of the box. And so just, can you comment on a guaranteed annual income or some level that we will not allow people to fall beneath given the state of emergency with our kids?
So the reason I am advocating for something like the American Family Act rather than guaranteed family income is I actually believe the insight of David Ellwood when he came to the realization that good social policy has to be attuned to American values. So what the American Family Act does, and I'm going to quote from my quote when I reviewed the proposal, is that it sends a clear message that society values and supports the essential tasks of parenting and recognizes the special burden that all parents of children, especially young children, face. The reason to give low-income parents with children essentially a guaranteed income is because they're doing something for society that is essential. Now, my Democratic self might like something bolder, but it seems to me that this is something all Americans can agree on. We value parents. Right now, fertility is going down in the United States, and it could be bad. It is tough raising kids on a low-wage job. So to the extent that this act sends a powerful social message, we value you. It brings dignity, right? Just in the way that Professor Garfinkel described, and it reinforces the critical task of parenting. So that was a little off topic, but I'll turn it over.
So we do in California have a bill introduced, Evan Lowe introduced the bill that will come to our committee, and so we will actually have the universal basic income conversation in California this year. And it's an important conversation to have. That stability is incredibly important. And you asked, Chairwoman, what would be the consequences to the state if, in fact, there was this kind of pull away from these programs? And I'm lucky to live in a state where our governor values a lot of these programs, and so we would probably try to backfill a lot of that. However, we do have our own other crises. We have a housing crisis that we're trying to figure out, and we also have wildfire and other incidents. And so how long we would have the capacity to do that, I don't know. But for others in other states, I think it would be more of a challenge. It would be devastating.
Congresswoman Clark?
So much to discuss, so little time, but you touched on housing, and the affordable housing crisis is such a part of this, and how we make sure that families have stable housing so they can build strong, healthy families that are employed. It is not easy when you don't have that fundamental housing component and are forced to move away from our job centers as we see gentrification, rising costs of housing, certainly something we're struggling with. But I also wanted to ask you about the role of childcare programs like Head Start, programs making childcare affordable. In Massachusetts, 1 year of infant and toddler care can be more expensive than college tuition for families. And often the transportation voucher, if you're lucky enough to get a voucher, is so underfunded. And to say to parents and students, parents who are students, that you have to have these requirements, but your voucher is only good for 8 hours, can be just an impossible balance. So if anyone could just talk about the importance of making sure that we are having rich early education environments open to every child, would be great. Yes.
So the committee did not consider programs that would, of the kind you're talking about, not because we didn't think they were important, but because the charge to reduce poverty in 10 years, just consider, for example, universal pre-K. I would say there was a lot of sympathy on the in the committee for that kind of proposal, but if someone's 3 years old now, 10 years from now, they're only 13. So you don't see the reduction in poverty. We recommended that there be another committee that look at long-term investments in children. We think that's I would say everyone on the committee believed that was equally important, but focusing on cash programs also had a great virtue. And I want to come back to your question about trauma, because I think insecurity potentially leads to trauma. And I must say, one of my very favorite experiments, people love experiments. In general, I don't think social science experiments are the gold standard, but there are other kind of experiments, like with animals, that we would never do with human beings. And now we're even pulling back with respect to monkeys. But I'll tell you about an experiment that showed that insecurity was actually possibly more damaging than just simply poverty. And there were 3 conditions, and this was with rhesus monkeys. One was the monkeys had to work really hard. The mothers had to work really hard to find food. Second condition, it was relatively easy for them to find food. And the third condition was random alternation of those 2 conditions. And the monkey mothers that had a poor environment, their mothering and their child outcomes, their offspring outcomes, were worse than the monkeys growing up in the rich environment. But the ones in the insecure environment, where they didn't know what was coming because it was random, they were far worse, far worse. And talk about trauma, and here I'm going to anthropomorphize, or whatever the word is. The offspring would curl up as if they're depressed in the fetal position, leaning into their mothers for 15, 20 minutes at a time. That was not uncommon outcome. So that's how I think insecurity potentially relates to trauma.
And we've seen that with work that we've been doing around trauma, addressing it in early education, in our school systems. And then we come back to so many of our teachers and early ed professionals have so much unresolved trauma. It is a very difficult position for them to become that person of trust. So it's a generational problem. But I think we're beginning, and California is leading the way in putting this together as one of the markers that we have to look at. And we know that being in poverty is an inherently traumatic event, and that, like you said, that insecurity, that not knowing, maybe one week there's good meals and the next week there isn't. You're moving, whatever the change is to adjust to a rapidly changing economic condition in the family it has profound effects that are real and have, if we really want to bend the healthcare cost curve, we better start looking at this. Thank you all again.
Yes, I want to speak on what he was saying about poverty as far as, with the school system and the teachers. The teachers, like I said, they're not teachers like we grew up with. And the teachers are being bullied, and they're bullying the children, and that's where I think that the poverty comes in at, where, with the kids, their mentality and everything, they don't really get everything that they really need from the school system, because one of the teachers told my granddaughter that, that he was going to make it his business for her to stay back. Now, what kind of stuff is that to tell a child? The school system is failing our kids.
Just want you to know on that note, where I went to high school, the principal said to me, because I was a cut-up, she said to me, "You'll never amount to anything." So, but I had an unbelievably strong support system
Absolutely.
that I could fall back on, and a support system that said, "You go, girl." That was it all about, and that's what's critical. I want to give you, what we want to do is, just like, very, very briefly, if you want to tell us something, what we should do, and I just want to go quickly down the line, so we're going to wrap up the hearing. Why don't we start with you, Professor Eden?
So I would say, whatever you do, think about whether it incorporates the poor and brings dignity. I think the American Family Act, which is a little bit more generous version of what was in the report, does that.
I'd like for you to think about, the children and child poverty, because in the middle class area, and especially in Ward 5, the children are suffering.
Yes.
We have a responsibility to reduce child poverty by half today because we know how to do it.
I'm embarrassed to be so small bore. Ask the CRS to give you a report on marginal tax rates and work and marginal tax rates and marriage,
Okay.
because you could do something with that.
Right, thank you. Yeah.
I would say prevention is key. Prevention includes universal preschool, and I would say that there's a new class of people, they are working poor, and the notion that they are stupid or lazy is outdated and ridiculous.
And demeaning.
The report provides an array of options. We tend to think in this town of all or nothing. We shouldn't. There are important incremental possibilities within the report that are flagged, so I would point your attention to those.
Thanks. Garfinkel.
So I understand that as an academic from Columbia University and heading of a poverty center, I can't endorse the American Family Act. But what I can say is that if something like the provisions that are in the act were enacted, it would be a good thing.
Okay, thank you, thank you. And just to wrap up, I just say, by the way, I also, and these are personal stories because people tell personal. I'm sorry. Yeah, you want to make a statement?
Oh,
before
yeah,
we
let me
go?
just
Okay, yeah, let's go.
thank you all for your
Please.
presence, but also for your suggestions. And Mr. Garfinkel, Professor Garfinkel, you mentioned the report had recommended us look at what some long-term investments in alleviating child poverty would be. I think we have enough here to talk about some follow-up next steps from the report. But also, I would add, Madam Chair, I think we need to take on looking at this issue and put into our report language, looking at the issue of systemic racism and child poverty, because everyone here has mentioned some of these underlying issues. And until we really bring that forward, sweep this out from under the rug, we're going to hold the line on some of the programs. We're going to maybe be able to do better with some, but we'll never be able to address the disparities with children of color as it relates to poverty. So I think we need to have something in our report this year that addresses long-term investments as well as the issues of poverty and racism, and hopefully the Academy can be part of this. So thank you again very much.
There's great suggestions, and I also would like to ask all of you if you would bear with us as we try to look at some of the recommendations and also try to figure out how we craft the kinds of policy initiatives that we can moving forward. You would be, I'll be just an excellent resource. What I was going to say is, I don't remember all the details, but my folks were evicted many years ago, and our furniture was out on the street at 79 Pearl Street in New Haven, Connecticut. And I can only recall what the stories are about what that did and what that meant, you know, to my folks in trying to make sure that they could be gainfully employed and take care of their only child. I would like to say this, that you know, there are people in this country years ago who fashioned a social safety net. They were Democrats and they were Republicans. They were not naive people. There are people who realized that as we moved down the road of industrialization and of moving forward, that they had the potential of people being left behind. And so what they tried to do was to put in place this social safety net that would keep people from falling behind. And for those who would say that nothing has happened as a result of those social safety net programs, really, quite frankly, don't look at the data. Let's just look at the data. And you have, this is in 2018, 4.7 million children lifted out of poverty because of the EITC and the CTC, 1.47 million from Social Security, 1.38 million from SNAP, 936,000 housing subsidies, 800,000 school meals, 497 from SSI, 429 from child support, 216 from TANF, 160 from WIC, 103 from the UI program, unemployment insurance, 72 from the LIHEAP, 27 from workers' compensation. These programs work. They work. And what we need to be doing is to strengthening these programs and adding on to them as we go forward and not fall into our own trap that says that people are not working as hard as they can and doing what they need to be able to have economic security. And that is why what you have done here today, all of you, I thank you so very, very much for your contribution to this effort. It means a lot to all of us. And again, I want to thank Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Congresswoman Lucille Roybal Allard for, in 2015, having the vision that this would be a direction that we needed to go in to study what's going on with childhood poverty. With that, the hearing is closed. Thank you. Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.